sold to the Alpha King. Chapter 2. Alara opened her eyes to the pale light filtering through the small window, the unfamiliar stone walls of the room bringing a moment of confusion. For a heartbeat, she forgot where she was. The events of the previous day came rushing back with a clarity that made her stomach twist. Her father's betrayal, the public humiliation in his throne room, and finally, her journey to this fortress belonging to Alpha Ezra. She had fallen asleep still in pain from her bruises, haunted by the memory of being sold like an object. She pushed herself upright, heart pounding as she scanned her surroundings. The room was modest, but far better than the cramped servant quarters she had endured in her father's castle. A narrow bed, a small table, and a wardrobe took up most of the space, with a wash basin near the window. The newness of it all disoriented her. As she sat on the edge of the bed, she tried to let the relief of escape settle in, no matter how twisted the circumstances that brought her here. She pressed a hand lightly against her sore shoulder, remembering the punishment her father had inflicted. Though the bruises still ached, she felt a grim sense of relief that at least no one here had beaten her yet. She wondered if that was enough to call it an improvement, then chastised herself for such a low bar. Regardless, it was morning, and a day of uncertainty awaited her. She had no idea what Alpha Ezra expected of her, beyond her new role and whatever arrangement had prompted him to accept her as part of a truce. She rose to her feet, stepping to the small wash basin to splash water on her face. As the droplets trickled down, she remembered the faint whisper she had heard the night before. It had been so quiet she questioned whether it was real. Yet the idea of her wolf, Asina, reawakening filled her with a hope she scarcely dared to entertain. She dried her face, taking a moment to stare at her reflection in the basin's surface. There were dark circles beneath her eyes, and her cheeks were pale, but she saw a spark in her expression that hadn't been there when she was living under her father's tyranny. She brushed her hair as best she could with the simple comb left on the table. Her dress was still plain, a soft gray one that Beta Damien had assured was hers to keep. She smoothed the wrinkles with trembling hands, finding small comfort in the routine. The morning chill clung to the fortress's corridors, and she shivered, recalling how the night's cold seeped through the walls. Still, it felt less oppressive than her father's castle, and that alone provided some reassurance. She found the courage to open the door and step into the hallway. The sconces burned low, leaving pockets of shadow along the walls. As she walked, she passed a few castle staff, warriors and servants whose curious gazes settled on her before they quickly looked away. She felt their silent appraisal. The daughter of Alpha Marcus, sold to Alpha Ezra. The story must have spread overnight. Her breath caught when she overheard two servants whispering as they turned a corner. "So that's her," one murmured. "I heard she's from some magical bloodline." The other responded in a hushed tone. "Or maybe that's just a rumor. She looks half-starved to me." Their footsteps faded, but Alara's cheeks flushed. She forced herself not to retreat into her room. She had spent too many years cowering already. She would keep moving. She rounded another corner, unsure of her destination, when she nearly collided with a tall, broad-shouldered man. She recognized him from the day before as Beta Damien, his face lit with cautious warmth when he saw her. "Good morning," he said. "I was about to knock on your door." Her heart still pounded from the near collision. "I'm sorry," she replied. "I was just exploring." Damien nodded. "You're welcome to explore. It might take some time to get used to the layout here. The fortress has many wings and corridors. If you need help, any pack member can guide you." She managed a small smile. He was, so far, one of the only friendly faces she had encountered in this strange new life. "Thank you. I appreciate it." He hesitated, then lowered his voice. "I came to tell you that Tanya wants to see you." He looked uncomfortable. "I'm not sure what for, but she specifically asked one of the guards to fetch you. I volunteered instead." Alara stiffened at the name. She recalled the blonde woman in the carriage, the disdainful glance, the possessive way she clung to Alpha Ezra's arm. "Do you know where she is?" Damien exhaled, rubbing the back of his neck. "She's in the courtyard. I can lead you there." They walked side by side through corridors that led into a wide open space flanked by high fortress walls. The courtyard bustled with morning activity, warriors sparring under the watchful eye of a drill instructor, servants delivering fresh water to stables, and a few scattered onlookers passing through. Alara felt the stairs follow her as they crossed the open space toward a stone archway leading to a quieter terrace. Standing against one of the pillars was Tanya, her blonde hair spilling over her shoulders. Dressed in a tailored outfit that accentuated her figure, she looked every bit the poised she-wolf accustomed to power. When she spotted Alara and Damien, a cool, pleased smile curved her lips. "Damien," Tanya greeted, her voice smooth as silk. She gave the beta a small nod before her gaze slid over to Alara. "You may go. I'd like a word with our newest addition. Alone." Damien's jaw twitched, but he bowed his head slightly. "Of course, Tanya." He cast Alara a quick glance of encouragement, then departed. A breeze ruffled Tanya's hair as she took a step closer. Alara forced herself to hold her ground, though her pulse quickened. Something in Tanya's gaze was calculating, even predatory. "Alara," Tanya said softly, her tone threaded with false warmth. "How are you finding our fortress? I hope your accommodations are comfortable." Alara raised her chin. "They are, thank you." Tanya's eyes glittered with faint amusement. She took a slow step around Alara, circling her as if inspecting a piece of merchandise. "I'm sure it's a far cry from what you had back home, although I've heard you were treated more like a servant in your father's castle." Alara's back stiffened. The words felt like a slap, and she couldn't tell if Tanya intended pity or mockery. "I managed," she said. Tanya's laugh was quiet. "Managed. Well, that's a perfect way to describe it. I want to make something clear. You are here by Alpha Ezra's reluctant acceptance of your father's bargain. That doesn't make you a member of this pack in any true sense. You have no rank, no influence." She paused, letting her words sink in. "I'm sure you understand that everything that matters in this fortress, in this pack, flows through him. And I am very close to him." Alara swallowed. The words stung. She already knew her place was tenuous, but having it laid out so bluntly made her feel like the ground had been pulled out from beneath her feet. "I have no intention of interfering," she said carefully, trying to keep her voice steady. Tanya gave her a slow, patronizing smile. "I'm pleased to hear that. However, you should know that some among us suspect you may hold a key to unlocking certain powers, rumors about your mother's bloodline. Whether or not that's true, I have no interest in seeing you become a distraction or a threat." A flicker of anger sparked inside Alara. She had never asked for any of this, yet here she was, being regarded as a potential threat. "I don't know anything about powers," she said, a trace of defiance in her tone. "I barely know anything about my mother's lineage. My father never taught me." Tanya's expression was unreadable, though Alara sensed she found this admission more encouraging than discouraging. "Then I suggest you keep to your tasks and remain quiet," she said coolly. "Alpha Ezra is a busy man and he needs no additional burdens. If you're wise, you'll obey." Alara forced herself not to look away from Tanya's piercing gaze. For a moment, silence stretched. The noises of training and conversation in the courtyard seemed distant. She reminded herself of her vow to endure. "Understood," she said at last. Tanya stepped back, satisfied. "Good. We'll talk again if necessary." With that, she turned and walked away, leaving Alara standing near the archway, her heart pounding. She let out a shaky breath. She had expected hostility, but experiencing it firsthand was unsettling. Despite the tension crackling in the air, she refused to let Tanya see her, intimidated. It helped that she felt genuine resentment toward the woman who clearly saw herself as queen of this place. Alara reminded herself that she had survived worse. Even so, her hands trembled slightly. Damien soon reappeared as if watching from a distance. He stepped up beside her, casting a wary glance in the direction Tanya had gone. "Are you all right?" Alara nodded slowly. "I'll survive." "Good," he said, relief flickering in his eyes. "Come on, let's get you out of the courtyard. I have a feeling everyone is just a bit too curious about you." She agreed, grateful for the chance to escape the stares and tension. They walked back into the fortress's interior, where the hallways were cooler and dimly lit by the morning sun. At one point, Beta Damien paused near a small alcove where Gamma Lucas stood reading a sheet of parchment. Lucas was a lean man with keen eyes and a thoughtful expression. He glanced up and offered Alara a slight smile. "Ah, so we finally meet properly," Lucas said, rolling up the parchment. "Alara, yes? I'm Gamma Lucas." She inclined her head. "It's nice to meet you," she replied softly. She recalled seeing him in the throne room the day before, though all of it was a blur. Damien looked between them. "Lucas was away when you arrived. He's been curious to know more about the new addition to our pack." Lucas's smile carried a hint of apology. "I've seen your arrival cause quite a stir. Word travels fast in a fortress like this. Everyone is whispering about a daughter of an alpha sold to ours." Alara offered a wry smile. "It's not exactly how I imagined my life would go, but here I am." Damien and Lucas exchanged a glance. There was sympathy in their expressions, but also caution. Damien cleared his throat. "We wanted you to know that, while Tanya speaks for herself, there are those among the pack who prefer to watch and see who you really are, rather than judge you by your father's sins." Alara relaxed a fraction, touched by the sentiment. "I appreciate that. I know I'm an outsider, but I'd rather not be treated like I'm worthless." Lucas nodded. "Tanya has a strong influence here, especially over Alpha Ezra. She claims to be from a lineage similar to yours, though details are scarce. Many of us remain neutral, but we're aware not everything is as it seems." Alara felt her heart stir with both curiosity and wariness. "She mentioned something about my mother's bloodline, but truthfully, I barely know anything. My father never allowed me to learn." Damien and Lucas shared a look as though considering how to respond. Damien lowered his voice. "Rumors aside, you're here now. If you need help navigating your new role, you can come to us. It might not shield you from Tanya's hostility, but we'll do what we can, that's all we can promise." Alara hesitated, unsure how much to trust them, but a part of her yearned for allies, however tentative. "Thank you," she said quietly. "I'm not used to kindness." Lucas reached out and touched her shoulder lightly, careful not to aggravate her bruises. "We've heard the stories. I don't doubt you've survived more than most realize. You have my respect." Warmth flickered inside Alara. She felt a surge of gratitude for the first genuine kindness she had encountered in so long. Damien gave her a faint smile, and they parted ways, leaving her to continue exploring the corridors. Afterward, she found herself pacing the fortress, her mind full of conflicting emotions: gratitude for Damien and Lucas, wariness of Tanya, and a tangled sense of confusion about Alpha Ezra's role in all this. The hours passed with an uneasy slowness. She discovered a small library, though she was too on edge to settle and read. She found the dining hall, where a handful of warriors watched her intently as she took a simple meal of bread, fruit, and water. She ate alone, back stiff, noticing how few approached her. Whispers punctuated her every move, reminding her that she was far from home, surrounded by strangers who had heard rumor upon rumor about her. Eventually, late in the afternoon, a summons arrived. A young guard with a tight-lipped expression approached, saying only that Alpha Ezra required her presence. Alara's heart lurched. She followed him through winding corridors, up a set of stairs and then to a heavy wooden door. The guard opened it, gesturing silently for her to enter. She stepped into a spacious room dominated by an imposing desk near large windows. Velvet drapes framed the windows, letting in golden sunlight that cast a subdued glow across shelves stacked with books and parchment. Behind the desk stood Alpha Ezra, wearing a fitted black shirt that accentuated his imposing shoulders. He lifted his gaze from some document he was studying. She steeled herself and inclined her head respectfully. "You sent for me." He nodded. "Close the door." She did so, aware of the guard stationed outside. Now alone, she felt the weight of his amber gaze upon her. There was an intensity in his eyes that made her want to shrink back, but she refused to yield to that impulse. He gestured for her to approach the desk. She walked forward, hands clasped together to keep them from trembling. The memory of her father forcing her to her knees in the throne room flashed through her mind, an echo of old shame. She forced it aside. Ezra's voice was cool and measured. "I want to make one thing clear. I did not accept you here because I wanted to. Your father cornered me into a situation where refusing his offer would have been considered an insult to our entire pack. Rival packs watch us for any sign of weakness. It left me little choice." Alara's chest tightened. She stared at a spot on the desk to avoid the full force of his gaze. "I understand." "I doubt you do," he said, leaning forward. "You were used as a pawn, and I was forced to take you in. That does not mean you are free to do as you please." A flash of indignation stirred within her. "I never asked for special treatment." His eyes narrowed. "You speak boldly for someone in your position." She swallowed hard but met his gaze. "I've learned that being silent doesn't stop people from hurting me. If I speak plainly, it's because I have nothing left to lose." She regretted the words the moment they left her lips, fearing she'd gone too far. But the tension within her demanded an outlet. A faint flicker of emotion crossed his face, surprise or perhaps respect. It passed quickly, replaced by his usual guarded demeanor. "I have no intention of hurting you unless you give me cause." She released a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. "That's more than I'm used to," she said quietly, unable to keep the bitterness from her tone. "I will do my best to follow whatever instructions you give." He studied her for a long moment, then glanced at a stack of parchment on his desk. "There's talk of your mother's magical lineage." His words were calm, but she sensed the curiosity lurking beneath them. "How much do you know?" Alara hesitated. "Very little. My mother died when I was 12. My father refused to speak about her, so I grew up in ignorance. I've heard rumors that she was descended from a line of powerful she-wolves. But that's all." Ezra tapped a finger on the desk. "Some say you might hold that power as well, Dormant. This fortress is filled with old texts. If I instruct the historians to search for references to your mother's line, would you cooperate in exploring whatever truth might come to light?" She felt a pang of longing. The thought of learning more about her mother made her chest ache. She nodded cautiously. "Yes, if it helps me understand who I am." He inclined his head. "Good, for now your duties will be limited. I'll not have you degrade yourself like a servant in front of my pack. We'll see what tasks suit you. Stay out of Tanya's way unless she requires your assistance. She has influence here." Alara tried to read his expression for any sign of how he felt about Tanya, but it was unreadable. "Yes, Alpha Ezra," she said softly. He rose, walking to the window. The sunlight illuminated him, accentuating the rigid lines of his shoulders. "I lost my mate to treachery some time ago. The packs have been in a delicate balance of power ever since. Tanya's been close to me, providing counsel, though I wonder sometimes at her motivations." Alara stood quietly, absorbing his words. She sensed the raw wound behind them, the grief he struggled to bury. She thought of how her father's cruelty had been forged by the loss of his mate as well. But unlike Marcus, Ezra's anguish did not seem to twist him into senseless malice. Instead, it made him guarded, suspicious of everyone's intentions. She realized with a spark of hope that perhaps he wasn't inherently cruel. He turned, his amber gaze impaling her once more. "I don't know what your father hoped to achieve by sending you here, aside from rid himself of the cost of raising you. Yet part of me wonders if he believed your lineage might be valuable. He's cunning enough to understand the advantage that might bring. She shook her head. He never once treated me like an asset until you arrived. I think he simply wanted to end our conflict at my expense. Ezra's lips thinned. Perhaps. Nonetheless, I'll explore all angles. You can go now. I may have further questions for you later. Keep to the main areas of the fortress. I don't want you wandering the restricted wings. She exhaled slowly. I understand, thank you. As she turned to leave, he spoke again. Alara. She froze, turning halfway. Yes? He hesitated, his expression almost uncertain. I won't tolerate disobedience, but you may speak if you truly believe there's something I should hear. I'm not blind to the possibility that your presence might be more significant than I expected. She nodded, feeling a flicker of gratitude. I'll remember that. Then she exited, heart fluttering. The fortress corridors seemed a little less daunting after that exchange, though her emotions whirled in her chest. Part of her was relieved that Ezra might at least be less brutal than her father. Another part bristled at being spoken to like a subordinate. She was an Alpha's daughter, despite everything. The evening wore on, and she found a quiet corner near a small garden enclosed by high stone walls. It was a peaceful place, with only a few straggly plants and a bench beside a modest fountain. She sank onto the bench, letting the cool air wash over her. She tried to make sense of her new reality, turning over Ezra's words in her mind. He was suspicious, weighed down by his grief. Yet something in him seemed to stir when he looked at her. She wondered if it was only curiosity about her rumored power, or if something else lay beneath that distant gaze. Her thoughts drifted to her wolf. She closed her eyes, trying to recall the faint whisper she had sensed, the intangible presence that felt like a Sena. The memory teased her, slipping away like grains of sand through her fingers. She wanted so badly to reconnect with that missing part of her soul. Perhaps being away from Marcus's oppression would help Asena reemerge. She breathed quietly, willing her mind into a stillness, hoping for a sign. When only silence greeted her, she opened her eyes to see the sky dimming. Nightfall would arrive soon. A swirl of anxiety welled in her. She had no official place here, no role or rank. Tanya's hatred, the warrior's curiosity, and Ezra's distant authority pressed in on all sides. She swallowed hard and decided it was time to retire before she attracted more unwanted attention. As she stood, footsteps on the stone path startled her. She turned to see Alpha Ezra approaching. He paused as though surprised to find her here alone. The tension from their earlier conversation remained, but there was a trace of curiosity in his expression. You like this spot? He asked, hands folded behind his back. She nodded. It's quiet, I needed a moment to think. He glanced at the small fountain trickling calmly. I don't often come here. My father built this place for my mother, but she passed many years ago. It's been neglected. Something in his voice resonated with her. It's not too late to restore it, she ventured, feeling strangely emboldened. Small changes, regular care. It can become beautiful again. He looked at her, and for a second she thought he might scoff at her optimism. Instead, he simply nodded. Maybe, he said, though the way he said the word made it sound like a personal confession. I was on my way to find you. Her heart rate kicked up. Did you need something, Alpha? He exhaled, gesturing to the bench. I want to speak with you about your father's kingdom. It's best done privately. She perched on the bench again, and he settled at the opposite end, leaving a cautious distance between them. She noticed a faint tension in his frame, like he didn't often let down his guard. She recalled Tanya's remark about how close she was to him, and it made Alara uneasy, but she pushed that feeling aside. He asked about Marcus's alliances, the extent of his territory, and whether there were ongoing feuds that might threaten the fortress now that she was here. She answered as best she could, though her knowledge was limited, given how little her father permitted her to see. Still, she offered a few details about various lesser pacts that Marcus occasionally clashed with. Ezra listened intently, occasionally pressing for more specific information. She ventured a question of her own. "Why do you ask me instead of sending your spies or scouts?" His lips curved in the hint of a frown. "I have those too, but Marcus's domain is notoriously closed off. The way you were treated suggests you might have observed more from the sidelines than others suspect. I'm trying to see if your father's act of selling you could have deeper ramifications." Alara considered it. "I'm not aware of any grand plot against you, if that's what you mean. My father didn't share his schemes with me." She laced her fingers together. "I think he only did this to rid himself of me and possibly to shame you. He's cruel and vindictive, but I don't know if he has any plan beyond that." Ezra accepted her words with a thoughtful nod. He sank into a brief silence, turning his gaze to the fountain. She watched his profile in the fading light, noticing the faint lines of strain around his eyes. When he spoke again, it was with a softer tone. "If your father is done with you, what do you want for yourself?" The question shocked her. No one had asked her what she wanted in a very long time. She struggled to find an answer. I'm not sure. I've spent years just trying to survive day by day. Right now, all I want is a chance to live, without fear." He studied her face, expression unreadable. "No ambition for revenge?" She swallowed. "I have hatred for him, but I'm tired of living in that darkness. I watched it consume him after my mother died. I'd rather find a purpose, something that gives me life, not more anger." For a moment, his stoic mask slipped, revealing a flash of recognition or understanding. Then he nodded and stood. "Consider your answer well. Not having a purpose can be dangerous in a place like this. If you truly possess some hidden power, you may find yourself at the center of more conflict than you realize. Be ready." She stood as well, heart pounding from the strain of this conversation. "I will try," she said. He seemed poised to say more, but then the soft sound of footsteps signaled an interruption. They both looked to see Tanya approaching, eyes narrowed slightly in disapproval. Alara took a step back, giving the pair space. Tanya said nothing to Alara, but spoke directly to Ezra in a hushed voice, as though Alara wasn't there. "We have an urgent matter with the Northern Patrol," Tanya said. "I came to fetch you." Ezra's demeanor shifted, closing off again. He cast a final glance at Alara and inclined his head in a gesture of quiet dismissal before following Tanya out of the garden. Alara was left alone, a storm of thoughts raging in her mind. She had seen a flicker of something in Ezra she hadn't expected, but Tanya's sudden intrusion reminded her that whatever connection they had was fragile at best. Night settled fully by the time Alara returned to her room. Exhaustion weighed on her limbs, both from the physical stress of the day and the emotional toll of these new encounters. She closed the door behind her and leaned against it, pressing her forehead to the rough wood. She thought about the day's events, her conversation with Tanya, the wary kindness of Damien and Lucas, her intense discussions with Ezra. She felt closer to the truth that perhaps she was more than a discarded daughter, that her mother's legacy might hold genuine power. She changed into a spare nightdress, hissing softly at the pain in her bruised shoulder. Slipping under the covers, she let out a trembling sigh. A swirl of anxiety lingered in her chest, but behind it, there was also a flicker of determination. She refused to be beaten down any longer. She had endured her father's cruelty, and now she would endure whatever the fortress demanded of her. Maybe, in time, she would find a way to strengthen herself and uncover the secrets her mother had taken to the grave. The room was silent and dark, lit only by the faint moonlight through the window. She closed her eyes, and as she drifted near the edges of sleep, a voice resonated in her mind. It was soft but distinct, like a gentle breeze carrying her name. Alara. The sound brought sudden tears to her eyes. After so many years of silence, it was as if part of her soul was calling out through the darkness. She whispered into the quiet of her room, Asena, is that you? There was no immediate reply, only a warm sensation blossoming deep in her chest, like embers being fanned into a gentle flame. For the first time in years, she felt the faint presence of her wolf stir, a promise that she was no longer locked in lonely isolation. It was too faint to be a full conversation, more of a comforting pulse of awareness. Still, it was enough to fill her with a sense of cautious hope. She exhaled, pressing a trembling hand to her heart. "I'm not alone anymore," she murmured. The words tasted strange on her tongue, but that realization, that renewed bond, however tenuous, gave her courage she had not felt since she was a child. Sleep came slowly but more peacefully, buoyed by the fragile certainty that despite the fortress's dangers, a piece of her true self was awakening. Her final conscious thought before surrendering to the darkness was a silent vow. Whatever trials lay ahead, she would meet them with the quiet strength that had carried her through the worst her father could muster. She was Alara, daughter of Luna Elena. She would not be broken. And as night pressed in around her, she felt Asena's distant voice, promising that one day soon her wolf would guide her toward the destiny she never dreamed could be hers.